The first of the month always tasted of stale coffee and obligation. For Arthur Finch, it was a ritual etched into the marrow of his bones, a ceremony of lukewarm caffeine and worn-out ledger books. For 12 years, he had been the building manager of the Chamberlain, a responsibility he bore with the quiet resignation of a man who had long ago mistaken routine for purpose. The Chamberlain itself was a relic, a stoic old beast of brick and faded limestone that stood defiant against the city's relentless modernity. Its once ornate lobby, now a study in genteel decay, smelled perpetually of floor polish, old paper, and the faint collective scent of 100 lives lived in close quarters. Arthur knew its every groan, every shudder of the ancient elevator, every patch of plaster that threatened to surrender. The building was his kingdom, a quiet, 6-story world of predictable complaints and minor repairs. He liked it that way. Predictability was a balm for a man who had seen enough surprises in his life. His morning began as it always did. He sat in his cramped, windowless office in the basement, the hum of the boiler his only companion. The rent checks were due. Most tenants were reliable, sliding their envelopes under his door overnight. A few, like Mr. Henderson in 4A, would need a gentle reminder, which was Arthur's polite term for a firm knock and a pointed stare. He gathered the envelopes, sorting them with practiced efficiency. The Millers 2C, Mrs. Gable 5F, the young couple in 6B. Each envelope was a familiar artifact, the handwriting as recognizable as a face. He ticked them off in his ledger, the scratching of his pen the only sound. He was down to the last few when he noticed it. It wasn't under his door. It was on the floor of the lobby, placed neatly against the wall right beside the mailboxes. An anomaly. Tenants knew the procedure. This was a plain, thick manila envelope with no name, no apartment number, nothing to identify its origin. It was heavier than a simple check. With a sigh, Arthur bent down to retrieve it. Another tenant forgetting the rules, he presumed. Probably one of the students in 1D. He'd have to send out another memo about proper rent submission. The thought was more tiring than the act itself. Back in the sterile light of his office, he slit the envelope open. Inside there was no check, no note of explanation. There was only cash. A thick stack of worn bills held together by a simple paper clip. He thumbed through them, his fingers stiff. He counted. Once, then twice. It was $750. Exactly. The exact rent for a 1-bedroom apartment. His brow furrowed. He scanned the ledger. Everyone was accounted for, save for Mr. Henderson and the perpetually late art student in 2A, who would pay in cash. It was against policy. And why leave it in the lobby? He flipped the envelope over again, searching for any clue, any stray mark, but found nothing. He set the money aside, a small island of mystery on his sea of paperwork. It was likely a simple mistake. A new tenant, perhaps, whom the central management office had forgotten to inform him about. It wouldn't be the first time. Communication was not the company's strong suit. He would call them. But as he reached for the phone, a detail snagged at his mind. $750. That was the rate for the standard 1-bedrooms. Apartments like 2B, 4D, and 3B. A cold stone of certainty settled in his stomach. Apartment 3B had been vacant for a year. He knew this for a fact. He had personally supervised the crew that cleared it out after old Mrs. Ellicott had passed away in her sleep. He had locked the door himself, turning the deadbolt that hadn't been turned since. The apartment was empty, silent, waiting for a renovation that the management company kept postponing. So this couldn't be for 3B. It was a coincidence. He picked up the phone and dialed the main office. A disinterested voice on the other end confirmed his suspicions. "No, Arthur," the woman said, her voice tinny and distant. "No new leases for the Chamberlain this month. 3B is still marked as vacant pending refurbishment. Did you need something else?" "No. That's all," he mumbled, hanging up the phone. He stared at the stack of cash. The bills looked old, their texture soft, almost like fabric. They smelled faintly of dust and something else, something vaguely sweet like dried flowers. An unsettling quiet seemed to emanate from them. It was a mistake. That was the only logical explanation. A tenant from another building with the same address, a courier mix-up, a prank. He would put the money in the office safe. If no one claimed it by the end of the week, he would report it to the company. It was a problem, but it was a logical, procedural problem. He could deal with that. He bundled the cash, placed it into a deposit bag, and locked it securely in the small metal safe under his desk. He closed the heavy door, the click of the lock echoing in the small room. He tried to put it out of his mind, to return to the comfortable rhythm of his duties. But as he walked his rounds later that day, His gaze kept drifting upwards to the third floor, to the dark, blank window of apartment 3B. He felt a strange, unwelcome curiosity. An anomaly had entered his predictable world, and he had the distinct feeling that it was watching him back. The weeks that followed were a study in forced normalcy. The unclaimed money sat in the safe, a silent, brooding presence in the corner of Arthur's office. He did his job. He fixed a running toilet in 5C, mediated a noise dispute between the night shift nurse in 2F and the aspiring musician in 2G, and replaced the flickering fluorescent bulb in the third-floor hallway. With each mundane task, he tried to push the memory of the envelope further away. It was an aberration, a fluke. Any day now, someone would come forward, flustered and apologetic, and the strange event would be resolved, filed away as a curious anecdote. But no one came. The money remained, and the silence from apartment 3B remained absolute. He found himself inventing reasons to be on the third floor, checking the fire extinguisher or inspecting the window at the end of the hall. Each time he would pause before the door to 3B. It was identical to every other door, a slab of dark wood with tarnished brass numerals, yet it felt different. It seemed to hold its breath. He would stand there for a moment, listening, straining to hear something beyond the building's ambient hum. He heard nothing. The silence was perfect, dense, and somehow more unsettling than a scream. He almost managed to convince himself he had imagined the strangeness of it all. It was just money. Misplaced money. Then the calendar turned. The last day of the month bled into the first, and the familiar taste of stale coffee and obligation returned. This time, however, it was laced with a new, bitter flavor: apprehension. A tight knot had formed in his stomach as he descended the stairs from his small apartment to the basement office. He told himself he was being foolish, letting a simple mystery prey on his imagination. But as he walked through the lobby, his eyes were involuntarily drawn to the spot by the mailboxes. And there it was. The same plain, thick manila envelope, resting in the exact same position as the month before. It was so precise it felt like a statement. For a moment, Arthur's heart hammered against his ribs. He felt a dizzying sense of déjà vu mixed with a fresh wave of dread. This wasn't a mistake. Mistakes were singular events. This was a pattern. This was deliberate. His hand trembled slightly as he picked it up. It had the same weight, the same texture. He didn't open it in the lobby this time. He clutched it to his chest and walked stiffly to his office, locking the door behind him. The click of the bolt sounded unnervingly loud in the quiet basement. He sat at his desk, the envelope lying before him like a verdict. With a deep breath, he tore it open. The contents were the same. A neat stack of cash held by a paperclip. He counted it, his lips moving silently. $750. He leaned back in his chair, the worn vinyl groaning under his weight. Logic, his trusted shield, was beginning to splinter. A squatter? No. A squatter's goal was to remain undetected. They wouldn't draw attention to themselves by paying rent, especially not in cash left in the open. A prank? It was too consistent, too quiet. Who would have the patience for such a subtle, month-long joke? He had to be sure. He picked up the phone, his fingers fumbling with the keypad as he dialed the management office. Brenda, the same disinterested voice from last month, answered. "Brenda, it's Arthur Finch at the Chamberlain," he began, trying to keep his voice steady. "I need you to do me a favor. I need you to check the status of apartment 3B again. I mean, really check it. Are you absolutely certain there isn't a new tenant, maybe on a private lease I wasn't told about?" There was a pause, followed by the clicking of a keyboard. "Arthur, we went over this. Apartment 3B is vacant. It's been red flagged in our system for refurbishment since last August. No one can lease it. No one has the keys except for you in our head office. Is there a problem?" "No," he lied, his throat tight. "No problem. Just double checking." He hung up without saying goodbye. The phone felt slick with sweat in his hand. He turned his attention back to the money. He unlocked the safe and took out the first envelope, laying both stacks of cash side by side on his desk. It was then that he truly looked at them. They weren't just old, they were artifacts. The portrait of Andrew Jackson on the $20 bills seemed younger, the lines less defined than on modern currency. He picked one up. The paper was softer, the green ink faded to the color of sea glass. He scanned the fine print below the portrait and found it, Series 1974. He picked up another bill. Series 1969. A $10 bill was from 1977. A chill, entirely separate from the basement's damp air, crept up his spine. This wasn't money that had simply been in circulation for a long time. This was a collection. It was as if someone had opened a time capsule and used its contents to pay their rent. The faint, sweet smell of dust and dried flowers he'd noticed before seemed stronger now, clinging to the old paper. He sat there for a long time, the 2 stacks of cash spread before him like a tarot reading. The hum of the boiler in the next room, a sound that had been his constant, comforting companion for years, now seemed menacing, like the deep breathing of a sleeping beast. The predictable world he had so carefully curated was fracturing at the edges. This wasn't a procedural problem anymore. The rules of his ledger, of his neat and tidy life, did not apply here. The unease he'd felt before was gone, replaced by something colder and sharper. It was fear. A deep, primal fear of the unknown, of an impossibility that left 2 envelopes of antique money on his desk as its calling card. Someone, or something, was in apartment 3B, and it was paying its dues. The fear that had bloomed in the basement office did not fade. Instead, it planted roots. Arthur's life, once a predictable sequence of tasks, now revolved around a silent, 6-story obsession that culminated in a single door on the 3rd floor. The Chamberlain, his mundane kingdom, had transformed. Every creak of the building was a potential clue, every shadow a possible phantom. His other duties began to suffer. He was slower to respond to maintenance requests, his entries in the main ledger became terse and distracted. He had started a new ledger. A small, black notebook he kept hidden in his desk drawer. In it, he logged only 2 entries, a month apart, detailing the discovery of the envelopes. He described the cash, the old bills, the lack of any identifying marks. It was an attempt to impose order on the impossible, but the neat columns and objective descriptions felt like a child's armor against a nightmare. His days took on a new, grim rhythm. He found endless reasons to be on the 3rd floor. He'd spend 20 minutes inspecting a fire extinguisher that he knew was perfectly fine. He'd wipe down the already clean windowsill at the end of the hall, his movements slow, his ears straining. He became a connoisseur of silence, learning to distinguish the gentle hum of the building's electricity from the sigh of the wind outside. He was listening for a disruption, a single note out of place in the building's quiet symphony. Most of his vigils were fruitless. The hallway remained empty, the door to 3B impassive and mute. The other tenants on the floor, a young couple in 3C, a quiet bachelor in 3D, came and went, oblivious to the strange watchman in their midst. A few gave him odd looks, but no one questioned the manager's presence. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday night. A heavy rain was lashing against the building's windows, and the corridors were filled with the sound of groaning pipes and rattling frames. It was the kind of night that blurred the lines between a building's natural noises and something else. Arthur was doing his final walkthrough, the jangle of his keys a familiar counterpoint to the storm. He reached the 3rd floor and felt the usual pull. He stopped in front of 3B, the worn patch of carpet before its door now as familiar to him as his own reflection. He hesitated, then leaned in, pressing his ear against the cool, painted wood of the door. He expected nothing but the muffled sound of the rain. At first, that was all he heard. Then, through the storm's percussion, a new sound reached him. It was quiet, subtle, and undeniably internal. Creak. It was the sound of a single, old floorboard taking on weight. Arthur held his breath, his heart seizing in his chest. It wasn't the building settling. He knew those sounds intimately. This was specific, deliberate. He listened, frozen in place. A few seconds of ringing silence passed. Creak. It came again from a slightly different spot, as if someone inside were taking a slow, heavy step. Then another, tracing a short, deliberate path in the darkness behind the door. It sounded like pacing. A slow, mournful 3-step shuffle. And then, as quickly as it had begun, it stopped. The silence that rushed back in was profound, heavier than before. Arthur felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. He had heard it. Proof. A physical presence in an empty, locked room. He stumbled back from the door, his carefully constructed skepticism shattering into 1,000 pieces. He nearly collided with Mrs. Gable from 3A, who was just cracking her door open to put out her recycling bin. She was a tiny woman with sharp, bird-like eyes that missed nothing. "Goodness, Arthur, you look like you've seen a ghost," she chirped, her voice surprisingly strong. Arthur struggled to compose himself. "Mrs. Gable. Sorry, I was just checking on a draft." She eyed him knowingly. "It's an old building, full of drafts and noises. You of all people should know that." An idea, desperate and sharp, cut through his panic. "Actually," he began, lowering his voice conspiratorially, "have you heard any noises coming from 3B? The pipes in this wall can act up, and I was wondering if you'd been disturbed." Mrs. Gable's expression didn't change, but her sharp eyes seemed to look right through him. 3B? Heavens no. That place has been quiet as a tomb for a year. Quieter even. She paused, leaning on her doorframe. Always been a quiet apartment, that one. Even when people were in it. You remember the last tenant? Mrs. Ellicott. Arthur prodded gently. Oh yes. And the one before her, that nice family with the 2 boys. And the one before that. Her gaze drifted to the door of 3B, a faraway look in her eyes. You know, it's a funny thing. No matter who lives there, that apartment always has the same feeling. Feeling? Arthur asked, his voice barely a whisper. A sad feeling, she said simply, as if discussing the weather. Deeply sad. Like a room someone has just finished crying in. Some places in this building have a temper, some have a warmth. That one just has a sadness to it. It holds on to it. She gave him a final, shrewd look, then nodded. Well, good night, Arthur. Don't let the old building's groans get to you. She closed her door, the soft click of the lock echoing down the hall. Arthur was left alone, the sound of the rain outside and the sound of the pacing inside still warring in his mind. He was no longer just dealing with an anomaly. He was standing before a place that, according to its oldest observer, had an emotion. An apartment that felt sad. And inside, something was walking back and forth in the dark, its footsteps a lonely, rhythmic testament to the impossible. Sleep offered no escape. When Arthur closed his eyes, he saw the dim, lonely corridor of the 3rd floor. When he drifted into shallow dreams, he heard the 3-step shuffle of a slow, mournful pacing. The sound was now imprinted on his soul. It was a question that echoed in the quiet moments of his day, a rhythm of dread that beat just beneath his own pulse. Mrs. Gable's words about the apartment's inherent sadness had given his fear a new, terrible texture. It wasn't just a presence, it was a misery. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he could no longer remain on the outside. Listening at the door was not enough. Speculation was not enough. The black notebook on his desk felt like a catalog of his own growing madness. He had to see. He had to know. The mystery of 3B was no longer a puzzle to be solved. It was a wound, and the only way to cleanse it was to probe it directly. The decision settled upon him not in a moment of courage, but of quiet desperation. He would use the master key. The thought alone felt like a profound transgression. For 12 years, that ring of keys hanging by the door of his office was a sacred trust. They represented his role as the building's guardian, a protector of the tenant's privacy and security. Using one to enter a unit without cause, without a burst pipe or a fire alarm, was a betrayal of everything his job stood for. Could cost him everything. But the fear of losing his job was now a distant, intellectual threat compared to the immediate, visceral fear of the unknown. The nightly pacing in the empty apartment was rewriting his reality. If he found a flesh-and-blood squatter, he could call the police. That would be a relief, a simple, understandable crime. If he found nothing, not even a loose floorboard to explain the sound, then he would have to confront a much more terrifying possibility, that the problem was not in apartment 3B but in his own mind. He wasn't sure which outcome he dreaded more. He waited 2 more days, a period of agonizing anticipation. He needed the building to be at its most still, its residents deep in slumber. He chose a Thursday just past 2 a.m. The storm from earlier in the week had passed, leaving the city in a state of hushed, damp stillness. He sat in his office, the only light coming from his desk lamp, which cast long, distorted shadows across the room. He took the heavy ring of master keys from its hook. The jangle they made was shockingly loud in the silence. His fingers, clumsy with anxiety, searched for the one he needed. Most were modern, steel keys cut with sharp, clean lines. But the key for 3B was different. It was old, made of tarnished brass, with an ornate, rounded head. It felt heavier than the others and colder, as if it had retained the chill of the place it was meant to open. He pocketed the single key, leaving the rest behind. He couldn't bear their rattling accusation on his journey. He chose the stairs over the elevator, not wanting to announce his ascent with the groan of the ancient lift. His soft-soled shoes made barely a sound on the concrete steps, but in his own ears, his footsteps boomed. His heart hammered a frantic, syncopated rhythm against his ribs. By the time he reached the 3rd floor, a thin film of sweat coated his skin. The hallway was lit by a single buzzing bulb that cast a sickly yellow light. The doors to 3A, 3C, and 3D were dark thresholds of sleep, silent and unassuming. But the door to 3B seemed different tonight. It looked taller, darker, as if it were a mouth waiting to swallow him. He stood before it, the cold brass key slick in his palm. He listened, but there was no sound of pacing tonight. Only silence. A deep, watchful silence. Taking a ragged breath, he raised the key and slid it into the lock. The metal scraped, a gritty, jarring sound. The lock was stiff from a year of disuse. He had to put his shoulder into it, turning the key with a pained, shuddering effort. For a terrible second he thought it was rusted shut, that he would be spared. Then, with a sudden, violent thunk that seemed to reverberate through the very floor, the deadbolt retracted. Arthur froze, every muscle tensed. He was certain the sound had woken the entire floor, the entire building. He waited, listening for an opening door, an angry voice. Nothing. The building remained asleep, blissfully unaware of his trespass. He let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. The first barrier was breached. Now there was only the doorknob. He wrapped his hand around it. The brass was so cold it felt like a block of ice, leaching the warmth from his skin. He turned it slowly, the latch clicking with surgical softness. He pushed. The door swung inward on silent, well-oiled hinges, opening a perfect black rectangle in the dimly lit hallway. A wave of air washed over him from the apartment, stale, cold, and utterly still. It was the smell of a place that had been sealed for a long time, the smell of dust and stagnant time itself. There was no light within, only a profound, suffocating darkness. He stood there on the threshold, caught between the familiar, shabby reality of the hallway and the absolute unknown of the room before him. He had the key. He had opened the door. Now he just had to take the first step. Arthur stood on the precipice for a long moment, the dead air of the apartment a physical presence against his skin. The silence from within was absolute. Taking the final, irrevocable step, he crossed the threshold from the familiar hallway into the profound darkness of apartment 3B. He let the heavy door swing shut behind him, and the sliver of yellow light from the hallway was instantly devoured. He was plunged into a darkness so complete it felt like a liquid, pressing in on his eyes and ears. The sudden sensory deprivation sent a spike of pure panic through him. His breath hitched and he fumbled against the wall, his fingers searching desperately for a light switch. His hand found the cool plastic plate and he flicked the switch up. Nothing. He flicked it down and up again. Still nothing. Of course. The power to a vacant unit would be shut off at the breaker. It was a logical detail that, in the suffocating blackness, felt like a deliberate, malevolent act. The apartment wanted to keep its secrets. His heart hammered as he fumbled in his pocket for the small, keychain flashlight he always carried. The click of the button was a small, brave sound in the immense quiet. A thin, watery beam of light cut through the gloom, impossibly bright and wholly inadequate. It danced and trembled with the shaking of his hand. He swept the beam across the room in a wide, frantic arc. What he saw was both a relief and a source of deeper terror. The apartment was empty. Utterly, completely empty. Bare wooden floors stretched out before him, and the walls were blank canvases of peeling paint. There was no furniture, no boxes, no sign of a squatter. No bedrolls, no discarded food containers, no hint of a living inhabitant. Just a vast, vacant space. A wave of dizzying anticlimax washed over him. Had he imagined it all? The pacing? Was it just the building's old bones groaning in the night? For a fleeting second, he felt foolish, a man driven to breaking and entering by his own overactive imagination. But the feeling didn't last. As the initial relief faded, a more profound unease took its place. His flashlight beam, now steadier, picked up the details. A thick, uniform blanket of gray dust coated every surface. It lay like a fine layer of snow, a testament to a year of undisturbed stillness. It covered the floors, the windowsills, the baseboards. It was a perfect, untouched shroud. Then his light fell upon the floor of the main living area, and he saw it. The shroud was not as untouched as he'd thought. In the center of the room there were patterns in the dust. Clean, sharp-edged rectangles were traced onto the floor, areas where the dust was thinner, almost non-existent. He could clearly make out the footprint of where a double bed had been, a smaller square beside it for a nightstand. Across the room, another rectangle suggested a dresser. It was the ghost of a furnished room, an afterimage of a life that was no longer there. And then he saw the path. Leading from the spot where the bed had been was a narrow, winding trail where the dust had been disturbed. It wasn't the track of a recent trespasser. It was worn, subtle, like the trail of an animal through a forest. It was the path of bare feet. He could almost make out the individual scuffs and shapes. The path meandered from the bedside, across the living room, and terminated at a large, empty space against the far wall. An area that was clearly shaped by the 4 small indentations of an armchair's legs. His blood ran cold. He followed the path with his trembling beam of light. It was a groove of habit, a ritual worn into a year's worth of dust. From bed to chair, and he now saw from chair back to bed. A restless, repetitive journey. While his eyes were taking in this impossible sight, his other senses registered new information. The cold he'd felt at the doorway wasn't just the chill of a sealed, unheated room. It was an active, predatory cold that intensified as he moved further inside. It clung to his clothes and seemed to sink directly into his bones, a cellar-deep cold that had nothing to do with the temperature. And beneath the musty, dry scent of aged dust, another smell asserted itself. It was faint, clean, and entirely out of place. It was the scent of lavender soap or perhaps talcum powder. A delicate, personal fragrance that had no right to exist in this derelict space. Arthur took an involuntary step back, his shoes scuffing the dust near the doorway. The sound was a desecration, an intrusion. He had his answer now, and it was far worse than any he had imagined. There was no squatter. There was no logical explanation. There was only this cold, lavender-scented room, with its ghostly furniture and a path worn into the dust by an unseen, endlessly pacing inhabitant. He backed out of the apartment slowly, never once turning away from the darkness within. His flashlight beam shook violently, casting frantic, dancing shadows on the empty walls. He pulled the door shut, the soft click of the latch sounding like a gunshot. His fingers, numb with cold and fear, fumbled with the old brass key. He jammed it into the lock and turned, the thunk of the deadbolt sliding into place a final, desperate seal. He didn't wait. He turned and fled, half walking, half running down the hallway and down the stairs, not stopping until he was back in the solid, brightly lit reality of his basement office. He had gone into apartment 3B seeking an answer, and he had found one. There was no one in 3B, but it was not empty. The flight from apartment 3B ended in the harsh, fluorescent reality of his basement office. Arthur slammed the door shut, locking it, a futile gesture against a threat that wasn't trying to get in. He sank into his chair, his body trembling, his mind a frantic slideshow of impossible images. The ghostly outlines of furniture, the faint scent of lavender, and most vividly the lonely path worn into the dust. Sleep was no longer a consideration. He sat through the remaining hours of the night, the hum of the boiler a low, indifferent witness to his terror. He was past the point of questioning his sanity. What he had seen was real. A presence was in that room, a quiet, sad, and meticulously punctual presence. And it was paying its rent with money that was just as ghostly as it was. As dawn broke, casting weak gray light through the basement's high, grimy window, a new resolve began to crystallize amidst his fear. He could not go back into that apartment. But he could not ignore it either. To do so would feel like abandoning a post, like letting the madness win. If he couldn't face the ghost, he would have to unmask it. He needed a name. The key, he realized, was not the brass one in his pocket, but the paper one on his desk. He retrieved the 2 envelopes from the safe and spread the antique bills under his lamplight. They were his only tangible connection to the entity, the only artifacts it had ever passed from its world into his. The dates on them, 1969, 1974, 1977, were a message. He just needed someone who could read it. He spent the morning making phone calls, his voice a strained, raspy version of its usual self. He invented a story about finding a box of old bills while clearing out his late grandfather's attic. He spoke to a coin dealer who offered to buy them by weight and a banker who suggested he simply deposit them. Neither was interested in their history. Finally, a librarian at the city's central branch gave him a name. Dr. Elias Thorne, a professor of regional history at the local university, a man known for his expertise in 20th century economics and ephemera. He secured an appointment for that afternoon. He carefully selected a few bills from each envelope, a 10, 2 20s, and a 5, and placed them in a clean, new envelope. To walk with them in his pocket felt strange, like carrying a secret history. The university archives were a world away from the Chamberlain. It was a place of hushed reverence, high ceilings, and the clean, dry smell of preserved paper. Dr. Thorne was a small, neat man with a bright shock of white hair and eyes that magnified his intense curiosity through thick glasses. His office was a chaotic nest of books, maps, and precariously stacked document boxes. "Mr. Finch," he said, shaking Arthur's hand with a surprisingly firm grip. "So, you have a time capsule for me?" "Something like that," Arthur managed, his throat dry. He laid the bills out on the professor's cluttered desk. "I was hoping you could tell me something about them. More than just the date." Dr. Thorne picked up a bill with the delicacy of a surgeon, holding it up to the light. He peered at it through a loupe, a small smile playing on his lips. "Well, they're certainly authentic. and in remarkable condition for their age. Not uncirculated but well preserved. This one, a series 1969 B20, a beautiful note. You see the subtle changes in the treasury seal? Fascinating. He examined each one in turn. A decent little collection. Represents a very specific period of American currency. What period is that? Arthur pressed, leaning forward. Well, the bills were printed over several years, the professor explained, settling back in his chair. But that doesn't tell the whole story. The important thing is when they likely left circulation. People who hoard cash tend to do it in a single period. They'll empty a bank account and put the money in a coffee can or under a mattress. Based on the specific series here, the where, the combination. I'd say this little bundle was put away and forgotten sometime in the mid to late 1970s. Arthur felt a jolt, a spark of connection. Can you be more specific? Dr. Thorne warmed to the challenge, tapping a finger on the 1974 bill. This is the core of it. This series was incredibly common for about 5 years. So, my educated guess? This money was withdrawn and stored somewhere dark and dry between, say, 1975 and 1980 at the latest. It's a snapshot of the cash that would have been in a person's wallet during that specific window of time. The words hung in the air. 1975 to 1980. It wasn't just a random assortment of old money. It was a message, a timestamp. The entity in 3B wasn't just a ghost. It was a ghost from a specific era. Is there anything else you can tell me? Arthur asked, his voice low. Only that your grandfather, or whoever saved these, clearly trusted cash more than banks, Dr. Thorne chuckled. A common sentiment in the high inflation years of the late 70s. It was a time of uncertainty. Arthur left the university feeling as though he were walking on solid ground for the first time in weeks. The fear was still there, a cold stone in his gut, but it was no longer a formless, shapeless dread. He had a tangible clue. A time frame. His investigation had a new, clear direction. He no longer needed to listen at the door of 3B. The answers were not in there. They were somewhere else in the building, buried in paper and ink, waiting in the same dust and silence. They were in the building's own archives, in the tenant ledgers from a decade-long past. He now knew exactly where, and when, to start digging. Armed with a time frame, Arthur felt a grim sense of purpose that temporarily eclipsed his fear. The entity in 3B was no longer an entirely unknowable horror, it was a historical puzzle, and he was standing in the middle of the archive that held the answer. He bypassed his office and went straight to the far corner of the basement, to a heavy steel door marked Records. He hadn't been in this room for years. It was a tomb for the building's forgotten paperwork, a place where the past was left to slowly decay. The air inside was thick and cold, heavy with the smell of damp concrete and aging paper. A single bare bulb hung from the ceiling, casting a weak, jaundiced light that did little to pierce the dense shadows between towering metal filing cabinets and stacks of cardboard boxes. This was the building's memory, its deep subconscious, and Arthur was about to go dredging. The boxes were labeled, but haphazardly. He started with the most recent, a box marked Tenant Leases 1990 to 1999, and began to work his way backward in time. Each file he touched was a ghost of a different sort, a snapshot of a life. The Millers in 2C, who had once lodged a formal complaint about a neighbor's noisy parakeet in 1992. A faded black and white photograph of a long-gone tenant's dog tucked into a file from 1985. He was sifting through the mundane, unremarkable history of 100 different lives, all in search of the one that had refused to end. Finally, tucked behind a stack of rusted paint cans, he found it. A large cardboard box, sagging with the weight of its contents, with the words Tenant Records 1970 to 1979 scrawled on the side in faded black marker. The tape that sealed it was yellow and so brittle it flaked away at his touch. His heart pounded as he pried the flaps open. Inside were several heavy, cloth-bound ledgers, their spines embossed with the years. He pulled out the one marked 1975. The pages were thick and yellowed, filled with an elegant, looping cursive from a building manager long since retired. The ink was faded to a rusty brown. He ran his finger down the column of apartment numbers, his skin picking up a fine layer of dust. 1A, 1B, 2A. His finger stopped. 3B. The space next to it was not blank. The script was neat and clear. Tenant, Pike, Walter M. Walter Pike. The name was so simple, so ordinary. Arthur felt a strange electric shock at seeing it, a name given to the formless dread that had consumed him. He quickly flipped through the ledger. Walter Pike was there in 76, 77, 78. A long-term tenant. He grabbed the final ledger from the box, the one for 1979. He found the entry for 3B again. The name was the same, but this time, there was another entry next to it, written in a different, hastier hand and with a starker, blacker ink. Lease terminated, November 12, 79. Reason, tenant deceased. The words seemed to absorb all the light in the room. Tenant deceased. Arthur stared at the entry, the date, the final, bureaucratic dismissal of a life. This was it. This was his ghost. He knew there had to be a corresponding file. He dug deeper into the box, his hands now working with frantic energy. He pushed aside folders for the Smiths and the Garcias until his fingers brushed against a thin, worn manila folder. The tab in the same elegant cursive read simply, Pike W. It was unnervingly slim for someone who had lived in the building for decades. With trembling hands he opened it. Inside there were only a few documents, all fragile as dead leaves. The original lease agreement, signed in a shaky but precise hand by Walter M. Pike on June 1, 1958. A few carbon copy notices of rent increases over the years. And at the very back, a single typewritten sheet of paper. An internal memo, dated November 12, 1979. He read it under the dim light, his breath held tight in his chest. Interoffice Memorandum 2, Central Management from A. Davies, Building Manager Re. Status of Walter Pike, Apartment 3B. This memo is to confirm that at approximately 10 a.m. today, I entered Apartment 3B with authorities after receiving a complaint of a persistent odor from the resident of 3A. We discovered the tenant, Walter M. Pike, deceased in his armchair. The coroner was called to the scene. Preliminary assessment indicates death by natural causes, cardiac arrest. It is estimated that Mr. Pike had been deceased for approximately 4 weeks. 4 weeks. The word struck Arthur with the force of a physical blow. The man had died alone in his chair and had remained there, undiscovered, for a month. A month of silence. A month of being nothing more than a growing, unpleasant smell to his neighbors. He was a man so reclusive, so utterly disconnected from the world, that it took 4 weeks for anyone to notice he was gone. Arthur sank down onto a nearby wooden crate, the thin file resting in his lap. The sadness Mrs. Gable had spoken of suddenly flooded the cold basement. It wasn't in the walls of 3B, it was the story of the man who had lived and died there. The ghost paying its rent was not a monster. It was Walter Pike. A lonely man who had died forgotten by the world, now desperately trying to hold on to the only thing he had left. His home. The name was no longer a simple clue. It was a tragedy. And Arthur Finch was the only living person who knew it. Knowing the ghost's name did not bring comfort. It did the opposite. Walter Pike was a name that echoed in the quiet moments, a name that gave a tragic, human shape to the terror. Arthur found himself caught between a profound, pitying sadness for the forgotten man and a primal fear of the entity he had become. He tried to resume his duties, to lose himself in the familiar rhythm of repairs and tenant complaints, but a permanent change had occurred. He now felt like a trespasser in his own building, constantly watched by an unseen observer to whom he was now inextricably linked. He began to actively avoid the 3rd floor. He would take the long way around, using the back stairs to get to the 4th floor rather than risk walking past that door. But the building had other ideas. A week after his discovery in the basement, a call came in from the couple in 3C. Their bathroom light was flickering erratically. It was a legitimate request, one he could not ignore. With a heavy heart and a toolbox in his hand, he ascended to the 3rd floor. The hallway felt different, charged with a tense, expectant energy. He fixed the light in 3C, making small talk with the tenants, his ears straining the entire time for any sound from next door. He heard nothing. As he was leaving, his professional duty satisfied, his personal obsession took over. He was drawn as if by a magnetic force to the door of 3B. He told himself he wouldn't listen. He wouldn't touch the door. He would just look. One quick glance through the peephole to confirm the darkness, the emptiness, and then he would leave. He pressed his eye to the small fisheye lens. It was as he remembered, a distorted, dark view of the empty living room, the far window a dim, gray rectangle. Nothing. He was about to pull away when a flicker of movement caught his eye. A shadow detached itself from the deeper shadows in the corner of the room and drifted slowly across his field of vision. It was tall and stooped, the indistinct but unmistakable silhouette of a man, and it moved with a slow, shuffling gait. The shape passed directly in front of the window, blocking the gray light for a single heart-stopping second, before melting back into the darkness on the other side. Arthur recoiled from the door as if he'd been burned, stumbling backward, his toolbox crashing to the floor. the contents scattered with a deafening clatter. He didn't stop to pick them up. He turned and fled, the image of the stooped, silent figure burned onto the back of his retinas. The sighting marked the end of the quiet period. The haunting was no longer a passive thing to be investigated, it was active. It knew he was watching. As the end of the month crept closer, Arthur's anxiety became a constant, sickening hum. He was consumed by a single, obsessive question. Where would the next envelope appear? The thought of finding it in the lobby again filled him with dread. The idea of it being placed directly in front of 3B's door felt like a personal challenge. Every unexpected noise in the building made him jump, his head snapping up, expecting to see the plain manila envelope lying on the floor. On the last night of the month, the tension became unbearable. He couldn't face the uncertainty of the morning. He decided he would meet it head-on. He would stay the night in his office, a lonely vigil in the heart of the building. He told himself it was to catch whoever was leaving the money, a flimsy, rational excuse that did nothing to quiet the terrified, irrational part of his brain that knew exactly who the courier was. He locked his office door from the inside, wedging a chair under the knob for good measure. He sat at his desk under the single harsh lamp, the building's old ledgers his only company. He tried to read, but the words swam before his eyes. He listened to the boiler's rhythmic breathing, the groaning of the pipes, the distant rumble of the late-night traffic. He was determined to stay awake, to bear witness. But the exhaustion of the past few weeks was a heavy weight, and sometime in the deep, silent hours before dawn, his head slumped forward, and he drifted into a restless, dream-filled sleep. He awoke with a start, a painful crick in his neck. The office was freezing cold. Gray, pre-dawn light filtered through the high window. He blinked, disoriented, the events of the night before rushing back. He looked at the door. The chair was still wedged. The lock was still thrown. Nothing had been disturbed. A wave of relief washed over him. Nothing had happened. He must have scared the prankster off, or maybe the whole thing had finally, inexplicably, stopped. He rubbed his tired eyes, stretched his aching back, and his gaze fell upon his desk. And his blood turned to ice. There, sitting in the precise center of his green desk blotter, was a thick, manila envelope. It hadn't been there when he fell asleep. He knew that with absolute, soul-shattering certainty. He had been locked in. No one could have entered. Yet there it was, a calm, quiet, impossible fact. He stared at it, his mind refusing to process what his eyes were seeing. The thin veneer of safety he had clung to, the idea that the presence was contained within the walls of 3B, was obliterated. Walter Pike was not confined to his apartment. Walter Pike knew where Arthur worked. Walter Pike could pass through locked doors. The message was unmistakable. I see you. I know you know. The arrangement continues. The line between Arthur the observer and Arthur the participant had just been erased. He was no longer investigating a haunting. He was a part of it. The impossible envelope sat on Arthur's desk, a declaration of war against the rational world. For 2 days he didn't touch it. He worked on autopilot, his mind a maelstrom of fear and disbelief. His small office, once his sanctuary, now felt like a cage. Every shadow seemed to lengthen and deepen, and the hum of the boiler sounded like a low, mocking chuckle. The ghost of Walter Pike was no longer contained. It had breached his final defense, and Arthur felt a profound, terrifying isolation he hadn't known since his own wife had left him years ago. He realized he couldn't bear it alone. The secret was too heavy, the fear too corrosive. To keep it inside any longer felt like a surrender to madness. There was only one person in the entire building who might understand, who had already touched the edges of this mystery with her talk of the apartment's sadness. He needed to talk to Mrs. Gable. He found a flimsy pretext, a routine check on the radiator valves, and knocked on the door of 3A. His knuckles rapped against the wood with a tremor he couldn't control. When she opened the door, her sharp, bird-like eyes took in his appearance in a single sweeping glance. His pale, sweaty face, his haunted eyes, the slight tremble in his hands. "Good heavens, Arthur," she said, her usual chirpy tone replaced by one of genuine concern. "You look a fright. Forget the radiator. Come in and have a cup of tea." Her apartment was the polar opposite of its neighbor. Where 3B was a cold, empty void, 3A was warm and vibrantly alive, filled to the brim with a lifetime of memories. Framed photos covered every surface, handmade quilts were draped over the furniture, and the air smelled of cinnamon, old books, and brewing Earl Grey. It was a bastion of warmth and life, and standing within it, Arthur felt the tight knot of his terror loosen just enough for his composure to crack. She sat him down in a comfortable armchair, a real one, not a dusty outline, and pressed a hot cup of tea into his hands. "Now," she said, her gaze soft but unwavering, "you tell me what has you looking like you've been wrestling with the devil." And he did. The words came spilling out, a messy, desperate confession. He didn't mention the money, that detail felt too insane, a step too far into delusion. But he told her everything else. The rhythmic pacing in the dead of night. The fleeting, stooped shadow he saw through the peephole. The constant, oppressive feeling of being watched. He told her how the coldness of the apartment seemed to seep through the very walls, and how he had come to dread walking down this hallway. Mrs. Gable listened without interruption, her expression a mixture of sadness and deep, weary understanding. When he finally fell silent, his confession hanging in the warm air between them, she simply nodded. "I was afraid of this," she said softly. "When you asked me about the noises before, I saw the look in your eyes. It's Walter, isn't it? He's still there." The casual way she said the name, the simple acceptance of the impossible, made Arthur's breath catch in his throat. "You knew." "I suspected," she corrected gently. "Walter Pike, he wasn't just a tenant, Arthur. For the last 20 years of his life, that apartment was his entire world. He loved this building. But more than that, he was terrified of leaving it." She took a slow sip of her tea, her eyes gazing at the wall they shared with 3B. "His wife and little girl died a long, long time ago. A car accident. It broke him. He just folded in on himself. The world outside became a frightening place for him, so he locked it out. I was one of the only people he'd ever talked to, and even then, only through a door cracked open on its chain. He told me once," she continued, her voice a near whisper, "that his memories were in the walls, that as long as he was in his home, his family wasn't truly gone. It was his sanctuary. But he had this terrible, overwhelming fear. Not of dying. He was afraid of getting old and sick, of being taken away to a hospital or a nursing home. He called it being evicted from his life. The thought of strangers clearing out his things, of another family moving in, it terrified him more than death itself." She looked at Arthur, her eyes shining with an old, lingering guilt. "That last month in 1979, I knew something was wrong. The newspapers piled up. I smelled what you'd expect. But I hesitated to call. He was so private, I didn't want to intrude. It was me who finally called the manager. I've always felt that if I had just checked on him sooner, maybe he wouldn't have died so alone." Arthur sat in stunned silence, the hot tea forgotten in his hands. The pieces of the puzzle clicked into place, forming a picture not of horror, but of profound tragedy. The pacing was Walter's restlessness. The shadow was his lingering form. The cold was his loneliness. And the rent. Arthur suddenly understood the rent. It wasn't a haunting. It was a protest. It was the desperate act of a terrified, lonely soul, trying to fulfill his end of the bargain, to prove he still belonged. It was Walter Pike's argument against the ultimate eviction notice, a plea to a world that had forgotten him, screaming in the only way he knew how, "I am still here. I am paying my way. You can't make me leave." Leaving Mrs. Gable's apartment, Arthur's fear had been transformed. It was still there, a cold knot in his stomach, but it was now wrapped in a heavy blanket of sorrow. He finally understood the ghost of 3B. He knew what Walter Pike wanted and what he feared more than anything. And he knew, with a dreadful certainty, that he was the only one who could answer. Arthur left Mrs. Gable's apartment with a mind reeling. The fear that had been his constant companion was still present, but it was now secondary to a profound, aching sorrow. He was no longer the superintendent of a haunted apartment. He felt like the sole mourner at a funeral held 40 years too late. Walter Pike was not a monster. He was a prisoner of his own grief, his spirit bound to the building by a love as strong and unyielding as the foundation itself. Back in the solitude of his office, he looked at the most recent envelope, the one that had appeared on his desk. He saw it differently now. It was not a threat. It was a sacrament. It was an act of desperate faith from a soul terrified of being erased. He thought of the endless, lonely pacing, the quiet shuffling in the dark. How exhausting it must be to be so afraid for so long. A new conviction took root in his mind. He had to end this. Not by exorcism, not by fighting, but by offering what no one had ever offered Walter Pike in the last years of his life: peace. He decided that the cycle of payments was a torment for the spirit, a constant, monthly reminder of his precarious existence. To truly give Walter sanctuary, he had to free him from his perceived debt. He had to refuse the payment. It was a risk, a communion with the impossible, but it felt like the only compassionate thing to do. He would not just refuse it. He would give him the assurance he had craved in life and had been denied in death. He took a clean sheet of paper from his desk. His hand, which had trembled with fear for weeks, was now surprisingly steady. He wrote and rewrote the message several times, wanting the words to be a bomb, not a provocation. He finally settled on a simple, direct statement. Mr. Pike, your tenancy is secure. No more payments are necessary. This is your home. You can stay. He folded the note neatly and clipped it to the thick manila envelope. He felt a sense of grave purpose as he walked from the basement, his footsteps echoing in the quiet of the midday building. He ascended the stairs to the 3rd floor. The hallway was silent, bathed in the pale, indifferent light of the afternoon. It felt like the calm before a storm. He knelt before the door of 3B. It looked no different from any other door in the building, but to Arthur, it was now a memorial, a headstone. He took a deep, steadying breath. "Walter," he whispered to the silent wood, "this is for you. Be at peace." With a feeling of solemn finality, he slid the envelope and the attached note under the door. It disappeared into the darkness on the other side. For a single breathless moment there was nothing. A perfect, profound silence descended, so deep it felt as if the entire building were holding its breath, listening. In that moment, Arthur allowed himself to hope. He had done it. He had communicated. He had offered peace. The silence shattered. The light bulb in the ceiling fixture above him didn't just flicker. It exploded in a violent pop, showering the hallway in a fine mist of glass and plunging him into semi-darkness. From within apartment 3B, a deafening, violent crack erupted, the sound of old dry wood being splintered by an immense force. The door shuddered in its frame as if struck by a battering ram. The brass doorknob rattled with a furious, metallic clatter. Then came the wail. It was a sound that had no right to exist, a sound torn from a place beyond grief or rage. It was the sound of a soul being ripped apart. It poured from the apartment, not as sound waves, but as a physical force, a wave of pure, concentrated misery and terror that washed over Arthur, making his teeth ache and his bones vibrate. It was the sound of a man's greatest fear being realized. Arthur scrambled backward, crab-walking away from the door, his hands scraping against the rough carpet. The wail intensified, rising in pitch until it was a single, sustained shriek of absolute betrayal. He had not offered peace. He had served an eviction notice. He had returned the payment, broken the lease, and in the terrified, grief-stricken logic of Walter Pike's spirit, he had just tried to throw him out into the cold, empty void he had spent his life and his death trying to keep at bay. He was on his knees in the dark, trembling hallway, pinned by the sheer, unleashed power of a terrified ghost. He hadn't healed a wound. He had poured salt in it. The violent, spectral tantrum subsided as abruptly as it had begun. The terrible wailing dwindled into a low, heartbreaking sobbing that seemed to seep through the wood of the door, a sound of pure, desolate sorrow. The hallway was dark, save for the pale moonlight filtering through the window at the far end. It smelled of burnt ozone and old, awakened dust. Arthur remained on the floor, paralyzed, the ghost's raw agony a living thing in the air around him. The depth of his mistake was a crushing weight. He had seen Walter's desperate need to belong as a debt to be forgiven, when in fact, it was the only thing the spirit had left to hold on to. The monthly rent was not a burden, it was an anchor. It was Walter Pike's only proof of existence, his only claim to the space he so loved. To refuse it was to cut the rope and cast him adrift. Charity was a language Walter's terror could not comprehend. He understood only one thing, the cold, hard logic of a lease. He knew, with a certainty that cut through his fear, that he could not run. To abandon the building now would be the ultimate act of eviction, a confirmation of the ghost's deepest terror. He had to fix this. He had started this terrible avalanche and he had to be the one to stop it. Slowly, painfully, he pushed himself to his feet. His legs were unsteady, but his resolve was like iron. He descended the stairs, not to his apartment to hide, but back to his office. The small, cluttered room no longer felt entirely his own. It was a space he now shared. He didn't reach for a blank piece of paper this time. That was the language of personal pleas, and it had failed catastrophically. He needed the language of bureaucracy, of officialdom. He rummaged in the back of his deepest desk drawer and pulled out a dusty cloth-bound book of rent receipts, a relic from a time before digital transactions. The paper was thin and smelled of his predecessor's pipe smoke. It was perfect. With a hand that still trembled, he uncapped his pen and began to fill it out. Each stroke of the pen felt deliberate, binding like the signing of a treaty. Date, the current date. Received from Walter M. Pike. For rent of apartment, 3B. Amount, $750.00/100. He paused at the bottom, then added in the memo line in clear, steady block letters, "Paid in full. Welcome home." He tore the receipt from the book. The thin paper felt both ridiculously flimsy and impossibly heavy in his hand. This was his answer. This was the new agreement. The walk back to the third floor was the longest of his life. The air grew colder and heavier with each step, the low, mournful sobbing from behind the door a constant, sorrowful lament. He was walking willingly back into the heart of his fear, armed with nothing but a slip of paper. He knelt again on the worn carpet before the door. The wood still seemed to vibrate with a residual, wounded energy. He could feel Walter's pain and terror on the other side, a palpable presence. "All right, Mr. Pike," Arthur whispered, his voice hoarse. "My mistake. Let's make this right." He pushed the small receipt under the door. The moment the paper vanished from his sight, the sobbing stopped. It did not fade. It did not dwindle. It simply ceased as if a switch had been thrown. The oppressive, bone-deep cold that had permeated the hallway vanished, instantly replaced by the building's familiar, neutral air. The palpable sense of rage and misery evaporated, leaving behind a stillness that was not empty but calm. Settled. The agreement had been accepted. The lease, which transcended life and death, had been reinstated. Arthur stayed there for a long time, kneeling in the quiet, dimly lit hallway. The building was finally at peace. The ghost of Walter Pike was at peace. The storm was over. He slowly got to his feet, a wave of profound emotional and physical exhaustion washing over him. He had made a terrible mistake and had, by some miracle, managed to undo it. But in doing so, he had accepted a new role. He was no longer just the building manager. He was the keeper of a contract, the silent partner in a lease that had no end date. He was the caretaker of a very, very quiet tenant. 6 months passed. The seasons turned, the tenants of the Chamberlain continued their lives with all the attendant minor dramas of leaky faucets and misplaced mail, and the building settled into a new kind of quiet. The violent, wounded energy that had emanated from the third floor was gone, replaced by a stillness that was deep and abiding. The sadness of apartment 3B was still there, a foundational quality of the place, but it was no longer a restless, terrified grief. It was a quiet, resting sorrow. Arthur Finch was a different man. The harried, lonely manager who operated on a fuel of stale coffee and resignation was gone. In his place was a man with a grave, quiet purpose. His movements were more deliberate, his gaze more distant. He was still the building's superintendent, but that was now his secondary role. His primary, unspoken duty occurred once a month, a secret ritual that defined his existence. On the first of the month, he no longer felt the icy grip of dread. He felt a solemn sense of responsibility. He would wake, descend to the basement and unlock his office door. And every time without fail it would be there. The plain, thick manila envelope sitting in the dead center of his desk. Its presence was no longer a violation, but a confirmation. A quiet, punctual correspondence from his most reliable tenant. He would open it, count the soft, antique bills and place them in the safe with the others. The collection of old money was growing, a strange, secret savings account that could never be spent. Then he would open the small black ledger he now kept hidden beneath a stack of old invoices. With his steady, familiar pen he would make the entry. November 1st, Pike W3B, $750. But then came the final, most important step. He would carefully fill out a slip from the old receipt book, the paper a tangible symbol of their pact. This morning was no different. He completed his office ritual and walked to the third floor, the small receipt held carefully in his hand. The hallway was peaceful. Sunlight streamed through the window at the far end, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. There was no cold spot in front of 3B anymore. There was only quiet. He knelt, an act that now felt less like fear and more like reverence. He slid the receipt under the door. For a moment he paused, resting his hand flat against the cool, painted wood. He closed his eyes. There was no sound, no shadow, no spectral wail. There was only a feeling. A faint, indistinct sense of a settled presence on the other side. It was not menacing, not sad, not even lonely anymore. It was just there. A quiet acknowledgement. An agreement honored. Arthur pulled his hand away and stood up. He looked at the door, this plain slab of wood that separated the world of the living from the quiet, eternal sanctuary of a single forgotten soul. He was no longer afraid of it or of what lay behind it. He had found a strange, silent companionship in his secret. He was the guardian of Walter Pike's final home, the keeper of his peace. In saving the ghost from his fear, Arthur had, in a way, saved himself from his own crushing loneliness. He was a part of the building's history now, his secret woven into the very fabric of its walls. He turned and walked away, his footsteps steady and sure. He had repairs to make on the 6th floor and a delivery to sign for in the lobby. His day was full of the mundane tasks of a building manager. But his purpose was here, in this quiet corridor, in the silent, monthly transaction that kept the past at peace. He was Arthur Finch, the caretaker. And some tenants he now knew never, ever move out.